Hello and welcome to On the Record, where we go behind the headlines for hard-hitting analysis with the experts. Well, the setting Annenberg retreat at Sunnylands in Rancho Mirage, California last weekend. It was the scene of a set-piece powwow between Barack Obama and his Chinese counterpart, President Xi. Barack Obama might well have told reporters his meetings with Xi were terrific. But the fact remains, China's reportedly alarmed by a US-led trade initiative dubbed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, which would establish free trade rules that govern a large swathe of the Asia-Pacific region without China's participation. It seems the TPP was discussed, but only on the sidelines of the Getting to Know You weekend. Well, in search of some answers, I sat down with Bates Gill, the CEO of the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney this week, to talk US-China relations, cybersecurity and plenty more besides. Bates Gill, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
We've seen that President Obama and his Chinese counterpart coming together as one in Palm Springs, a Getting to Know You affair, but also on that agenda, the issue of trade, China's role in the Asia-Pacific alongside America's quest to cement its position in this region. Just how do you judge the ability of the US to bring China into that bigger tent on an issue like the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Well, I think by and large it's progressed very, very well. I mean, you consider where China was, yes, 30 years ago and just how deeply integrated it has become in the global economy, far beyond, I think, the expectations of any observer even 15 years ago, where China would be today, yes, even soon to overtake the United States in overall GDP, probably in the next 5 to 10 years. So at that level, integration is deep, it is real, and it's not going away. And even the thought of, quote unquote, excluding China, I think is ludicrous. When it comes, however, to certain, let's say, let's call them membership organizations, or groups of smaller groups of like-minded countries coming together around certain issues. There, I think sometimes we do see, both in China and in the United States, somewhat mutual suspicion with one another. Yes, they do sit within certain organizations together and do some good work. But we see, for example, in China's efforts to develop free trade arrangements with some of its neighbors, excluding the United States. And now, at least for the time being, we see in America's effort to establish and create the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, China not yet a member, but the door is open. So I'm relatively optimistic that China will continue to be deeply integrated across all of these organizations.
Let's be frank about it, though. The TPP has been bundled up and dubbed a compromise measure between the failure of the World Trade Organization talks in Doha, now running into their 13th year, and bilaterals. Now, just back on WTO, China, of course, criticized for undervaluing its currency. That whole intransigence arguably stalling the process. Is that a good portent of things to come if China's going to come into this other body, this nascent body?
Well, I think at the official level, I don't think the administration would acknowledge that the TPP is intended to somehow be a way around the WTO, although I assume that there is a good deal of frustration given the length of the current round on the Doha round. But let's also recall that the TPP, yes, it's about trade, yes, it's about lowering barriers to trade and investment, but it's also a part of a larger strategy which has been termed the pivot, you know, the rebalance of the United States, a refocus of its energies and investments politically and otherwise in the Asia-Pacific. The TPP is part of that. We have to see it as not just narrowly as merely a free trade arrangement. It really is part of a strategy, I think, that the United States is trying to bring greater energy and resources to the region. And yes, I think there's a hope. There's a hope that if the TPP is successful, can raise a higher bar, have a higher standard, a greater openness, some greater mechanisms for both implementation and enforcement, maybe in some aspects of the Doha round, that can prompt some momentum.
Barack Obama, in setting out his priorities on trade for this year said, and I quote, "The United States continues to stress all potential new entrants to the TPP that they must be able to meet the high standards agreed by the negotiating partners." The United States is hoping to get this deal stitched up by October.
Yeah.
And I suppose it begs the question, whose high standards matter in all of this?
Well, clearly, the United States is trying to take a lead and drive forward standards, just like any country entering a trade negotiation that will most benefit itself. Now, this October date, I think, seems to me a little bit ambitious. There are countries that are already members or negotiating partners on the TPP, such as Vietnam, where there's going to be enormously difficult negotiations to be held, for example, around the role of state-owned enterprises, which now comprise something like 60% of the GDP for Vietnam. Looking to a different type of economy. Japan has now agreed to join into the negotiation. Notoriously tough trade negotiators, very difficult and sensitive sectors, not least agriculture and automobiles, and openness to foreign investment that all have to be dealt with. So whose standard? Well, it's ultimately going to shake down to a set of compromises across all these different countries. I think we can't expect these simply to reflect American interests. At the end of the day, it's going to reflect all the negotiating partners.
And yet, taking a sort of an arm's length view of all of this, there's been relative secrecy over negotiations, a refusal to release texts of those negotiations. How problematic is that in an age of increased public demand for transparency? That seems to be thwarting that. Even a microcosm, even on a trade issue, why such secrecy?
Well, I suppose a lot of it has to do with just the normal procedures that one undertakes when governments are sitting down together and conversing on somewhat sensitive issues. It's my understanding, however, that, for example, in APEC meetings, which encompasses a much larger number of Asia-Pacific nations, including China and others who are not a part of the TPP, there are briefings offered by the Americans and others who want to explain what's going on inside the TPP. So while it may not be broadly available to the general public, my understanding is that it is in the interest, actually, of the TPP negotiating partners to see what other countries they can bring on board.
Let's talk Obama's interest when it comes to surveillance and growing public calls for more transparency. I'm looking at an article from the Financial Times this week, and I quote, "The risk for President Obama is that if he does not take this opportunity to try to build confidence in what the intelligence services are doing, he could face a second term of further leaks and growing recriminations that will overwhelm his legacy." Simply put, how did he allow the Snowden affair to snowball the way it has?
Well, first and foremost, I think this has come as probably a great surprise to almost everyone who's involved with it. I mean, we have what is basically amounts to what is probably a lone actor who had access to significant information, taking this path upon himself to do. Those sorts of problems are extremely difficult to try and stem, and as we see, even more difficult to try and contain. But there's a larger dynamic going on here. We see an increasing ability, because of the technologies available, for governments to become far more adept at surveilling, watching, monitoring, understanding movement, communications, and so forth. It strikes me that while all of these actions were undertaken through legal processes,
which have been criticized for being rubber stamps.
It's certainly open to criticism, but let's face it, these were legal activities. These were not the sorts of activities which would normally be reckoned worthy of quote-unquote whistleblower. These are not illegal. But the question arises, is there still the proper oversight and interest in these very complex technological issues? And secondly, is the technology actually outpacing the ability for a democracy to monitor and assure themselves that these actions are being fully done in a way that reflects society's interests?
Do you agree, though, that without stronger public pressure, we'll see the intelligence services pushing back on any reforms and this issue could fester well into the future.
Yeah, I think it remains a little too early for us to know just how seized the general population is going to be about some of these revelations. Much of it, of course, was targeted against foreigners. Yes, Americans may well have been vulnerable. We don't know fully the extent of that. That's what's going to make politicians act. At this point, I think it's more about the classic bipartisan conflict that you're going to see in any democracy such as the United States, where this is an opportunity, you know, to be critical of those sitting in the White House and running these programs. If and as more revelations come out, if and as it's determined, for example, that completely innocent persons were being improperly surveilled inappropriately, then this could be a major, even bigger scandal for the administration.
Bates Gill, appreciate your insights. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bates Gill there from the US Study Centre, the CEO no less. We're taking a short break. We're tearing the world apart when we come back.